So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Mukund, Dr. Ashwin, Umang. Wonderful to have you. So, my first question is actually very simple. So, in your life, what has given you the impetus to work on ESG, or what is your connection with ESG in your life? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, let me go first. In my case, actually, it has a lot to do with the IIT training ground. So let me pay my homage to all IITians who are present here in the hall. When I went to Oxford, I went into the Department of Political Science. And I was looking for a dissertation subject at the time of my master's. And just then, this issue of global environmental politics was becoming very hot. How do you resolve problems that all countries have to collaborate to resolve? And how do you create the incentives and maybe the sticks, the carrot and stick approach to get countries to collaborate? Hadn't been done before. And suddenly you had the spate of issues from ozone depletion, the Antarctic ozone hole, global warming, tropical deforestation, the loss of biodiversity. How do you get collaboration going? And I thought a combination of my engineering days understanding of some of these issues, like ozone depletion, coupled with my training now in political science, would lead me to make some contribution in this new space of environmental politics. Then I came back to India. My doctoral dissertation was published as a book. I joined the Tatas, India's largest corporate house, partly because of the group's reputation for doing a lot on the sustainability agenda. And fast forward many years later, I ended up as the chairman of the Tata Global Sustainability Council and as the chief ethics officer looking after corporate governance, the code of conduct implementation in the Tatas. And that sort of brought me back to engagement with many of these issues. And I think one issue in particular in 2015 reminded one how important this agenda had become over time for corporates. This was the action of Norges Bank, the Norwegian sovereign fund, in pulling its investments in one of the large Tata companies, Tata Power, on the basis that Tata Power was a coal-fired thermal power producer, and coal was becoming a major challenge for companies that were trying to address climate change. And they said, we're going to pull our investments in any company that has a coal exposure. And that showed us how quickly the space is now beginning to change in favor of pro-climate measures. So in Tatas, we did a few things, and by 2018, I decided the time had come to actually set up my own firm, which would actually assist corporate India in this ESG transition, basis the interest in addressing global warming, the interest in better corporate governance, and many of the issues we just heard our keynote speaker talk about. So that's how I've landed up in the space. COVID gave a lot of time to write, and that's when my book on ESG and corporate responsibility emerged. So that's my story.
Yeah, so I studied civil engineering, and while people say civil engineering, it's actually in most parts of the world, the department is called civil and environmental engineering. So the E in ESG has been sort of part of my formal education. We took classes on environmental engineering, which is where I was sort of exposed to this. I think civil engineering is an interesting discipline because it sits at the intersection of what we call the natural and the built environment. So on the one hand, we build all of these buildings and structures that consume a lot of energy, and there's an environmental aspect to that. But we also are custodians of dams and canals and waterways and things like that, where again, there is sort of an emphasis on conservation of natural resources, treating water, etc. So I think formally, without necessarily calling it environmental education, sort of been a part of what I've been doing for several years. But when I was a graduate student at Stanford, there was a group that was just starting out there called Engineers for a Sustainable World, ESW. It was sort of a, I think sort of a branch off of a larger organization called Engineers Without Borders that some of you might have heard of. So I just got drawn into Engineers for a Sustainable World, and we had some practical experience it was around that time that the tsunami hit the eastern coast of Chennai. So a bunch of us actually came over to the Andaman Islands to try and rebuild some of the infrastructure in a small island called Hut Bay, where it wasn't just civil engineering. You were looking at the entire aspect of environmental engineering, social equity, equality, and how do you actually govern all of these structures. So I think, I've had brushes with sustainability throughout my sort of education here at IIT and abroad. And then once I've come back here, I work a lot on infrastructure projects, infrastructure policy, where again, these days now ESG is front and center. So I guess I've been hit with it from all sides, and we're just gearing up at IIT Madras to start this new school of sustainability where we're trying to bring all of this together. So that's my brush with ESG.
So I think what it shows is that how universal, multilateral this whole ESG is, and the same thing happened with me. I started as a science student and did my botany honors first. And while I was figuring out what's next, because it was MBAs and GMATs for the world, I got into law and human rights, after which masters in social work happened. And interestingly, this was 2 decades ago, and that time the whole focus of that educational format was also about government's infrastructure, the entire reproductive health to the last mile, government's responsibility to ensure social justice, social security and whatnot. The corporate sustainability or ESG was not even part of the curriculum. And back in that day, these things existed in silos. You had UNFCCC, you had Kyoto Protocol, you had International Labour Organization for a century or so, but it was not coming together. Human Rights Convention happened in 48 and Kyoto Protocol came in 90s. I mean, it's not like these issues were not relevant. So I got into studying law to understand this whole regulatory policy framework, which actually regulates everything about us, our societies, organizations, us. And that time I got involved in this whole, people's right to information. There was a lot of grassroots activism work which was happening for me, and more on the social parameters. Public interest litigation, because I worked with Prashant Bhushan while I was a paralegal. So I think I was just getting drawn and getting this academic professional experience. Then I joined corporate law firms. I understood how capital flows from private equity to venture capital to capital market. Then what happened with anti-bribery framework without India ever having to create a new legislation for it. Today you find that framework in organizations, well developed. You have whistleblower mechanisms, you have policies, committees, audit committee on top of it, till the board level and the decision making. I think that's what we are seeing is happening with ESG. So yeah, that's what got me here, and COVID happened, decided to be on my own and give this a start, and here we are.
Thank you, wonderful. So as we can see, we have real experts here. So I encourage the audience to really think about questions that you want to ask afterwards. There will be a short time to answer a few questions. So please think about it. This is a rare opportunity to engage. So my second question is about what is ESG? Is it different from SDG? Is it different from CSR? Or is it actually the same thing?
I'm sure each one of us will have a different view. My own take is, listen, at the end of the day, these are all just words. I think the critical issue is what the outcomes or the impact you're looking for in terms of your assessment of any situation. That is really what counts. 2 decades back, you had this concept of the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. Fast forward a decade or so, you had the Sustainable Development Goals. Before that, you had the Millennium Development Goals. Now you have ESG. I mean, these are all just, I think, the latest, I wouldn't say fad, because these are important issues, but these are the latest, let's say, terminologies or acronyms that have emerged. And as long as it's giving stakeholders a way of putting their arms around the size and scale of the issues and driving behavioral change in a way that most stakeholders would consider as positive, I think it works and it makes sense. ESG itself, by the way, as an acronym, was used at least once in a UN report going back over 15 years. So ESG itself is not new as a term, but it's, I think, got a lot of currency in the last 3 or 4 years. A lot of it has to do with COVID, and I'm sure we can discuss why it suddenly emerged. But I think all these are metaphors for the expectation, certainly as far as you're talking about business and corporates, that corporates will exercise due responsibility in the way they address issues that matter to stakeholders. So bottom line, I don't see very much that is very different in the way you think about these questions. The terms may change from time to time, but maybe you guys have a different view.
I completely agree with what you said, and maybe the only thing I'd like to add on is not so much to compare ESG, SDG, CSR, because I think they're all, like you say, different flavors of the same thing. They seem to resonate today. But I think if we compared these with the triple bottom line or even the 1992 Brundtland definition of sustainability and so on, I think 20, 30 years ago, we were a little bit more abstract in terms of how we defined social responsibility, sustainability, and so on. And CSR, the SDGs, ESG, I think are now evolving towards a more operationable framework. So you can actually audit people on ESG. You can measure yourself on SDGs and so on. So I see it sort of as a positive trend and agree with Mukund that I don't want to nitpick between what is ESG and how is it different from SDG and so on.
Okay, I'll go by my occupational hazard, which is I have to be lawyer to make distinction on, and I'll try to simplify it for everyone. So starting with the word sustainability to begin with, the whole idea is about creating a world which is for everyone, make it bring the shared values together, make it prosperous for everyone. So building, as I said, historically labor environment issues separately, then came the Millennium Development Goals, then came the SDGs. But this whole responsibility of ensuring sustainable world or contribute to it was with everyone. So all the stakeholders, government, global institutions, corporations, financial sector, we, individuals, civil society. And the biggest stakeholder, I rightly said, with triple bottom line, people started realizing that corporations are not existing in silos. They are having impact on people and planet to an extent which now with their size and scale is beyond governments what they can manage. So this whole journey about corporate sustainability started, and ESG as an acronym came with the United Nations principle of responsible investment. It was still a risk factor that had to be looked at when investment decisions were being made. But as shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism came, so their own responsibility on investing correctly. So ESG was devised as an acronym, how to assess a corporation on E, S, and G parameters. CSR actually was the same thing, but now we understand it in sections 135 and Schedule 7 of Companies Act, which is philanthropy, that you spend your funds on some social causes, and what happens to those funds is a separate story. But I think this is just the nuance difference on these terms.
Great, thank you. So actually, Dr. Ashwin, I wanted to ask you, can you explain a little more on the measuring part of ESG? How do you measure it? And there's obviously tricky parts to it because measuring can be tricky.
Yeah, it is very tricky. And I think it gets trickier as you go from E to S to G. So I think we haven't really wrapped our heads around how you would measure the E part. And so maybe I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And I think the problems multiply when you get to S and G. I think more than how do we measure, I think the fact is I'm not quite sure that we all agree that it needs to be measured at all. I think that's one of the fundamental challenges, is that we don't even look towards measuring our impact. So I think Mridula, when she spoke about, she was giving a talk, she talked about how businesses are under huge pressure to minimize their carbon footprint, is something that she said. So if that was really a pressure, then essentially I would say, this is my carbon footprint and I want to reduce it by 10%. And here's what I would need to do towards it. The problem is I don't think we even know, or I'm not even sure that we think it's important to measure it. So a lot of what happens tends to be very anecdotal. So I am now recycling my water in my facility, so I'm sustainable. I've given more jobs to women, and therefore I am now more compliant with ESG, etc. So I think the first thing that, the first sort of behavioral change I think that needs to happen is we've got to sort of prioritize measurement. And measurement of of E, S, and G. Then you get to the next question in terms of how do you measure? And these things are extremely complicated to measure because there are questions in terms of where do you draw the boundaries, where do you start? So forget measuring the social or governance side of it. Just take something a little bit more inanimate and sort of try to measure, say, the carbon footprint of a building like this. Where do you start? Do you start from when you started mining the limestone and sort of created cement and then transported it here, or go even further back? So the boundaries that you draw are vague. The science behind how you would actually quantify something is still up for debate. So I think we are very much in our infancy in terms of trying to measure not only the E, but therefore also the S and the G. There are some frameworks that are available, and the more that we look into these, the more we find some interesting frameworks. So there's something called life cycle assessment that's now within the engineering fraternity quite popular. But there's also this framework I came across called the planetary boundaries framework, which said there are sort of essentially 9 sort of things that you need to look at. Greenhouse gas emissions is one, but there are 7, 8 other things. And this is the extent to which the planet can take a hit on any of those. And so if you go past this, you've crossed the planetary boundary. And so can you use that kind of a framework to evaluate how you're doing on the E, S, and the G? So there are a few sort of frameworks that are out there, which I think are interesting starting points for discussion. But I think there needs to be a concerted effort across people who like doing research in this area, practitioners, the general public, to say, let's measure what we do. Let's get into more engaged debates on how we measure. And over a period of time, I don't know if there is going to be sort of a single absolute best way of doing this, but at least we evolve some standards. And once we evolve those standards, at least we can set benchmarks and improve relatively, if not absolutely. So to me, that's where we are, and those I think are the directions we should be thinking about when we start looking at measuring E, S, and or G.
Actually, I think I learned something just now. Because when we had a pre-run, we talked a little bit about the greenwashing aspect. I think this is not doing very well. So we talked a little bit about the greenwashing aspect, and you said, maybe there's not even an intent to greenwash. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little more, because measuring, if it's, if we don't even know what we're measuring and how we're measuring, how can we claim somebody's greenwashing if we... So handing over to you on this.
No, I think that's exactly the point, that some of these terminologies are so vague, they don't necessarily lend themselves to good measurement. And therefore, you can get away with a lot in terms of what you might claim. And that is the allegation that sometimes gets made against many large corporates, small corporates, many businesses, that they are making suggestions about things that they claim they're doing, which are either inaccurate or untrue. The point that I think we also need to understand, simply because the whole landscape right now is a little uncertain, let's not always attribute bad motives to why business or corporates do. Sometimes it is done with the best of intentions. Sometimes it's because the space is unclear. It's difficult to measure many of these things. And therefore, companies will report stuff. We've seen this in the CSR space. I think the number of glossy publications that started appearing in India over the last decade in the wake of the CSR regulations is unprecedented now, because you had to do it, you had to report it. People saw this as a good way of marketing themselves, marketing the work that they're doing. And you will say many things that don't necessarily stack up when somebody scratches the surface and gets into the depth of it to see what is it actually that you're delivering. So I'd say that greenwashing is a significant concern, but it can and will get fixed better and better. There will be a real need for regulatory action. One issue will be to define how you actually report on each of E, S, and G, for instance. The second will be standards that are established, which also give you a sense of what best in class means, what mediocrity means, what terrible performance means, so that other stakeholders can start judging whether the reports that are coming out, the measurements that take place, how does a company actually stack up in terms of its performance. Once those are in place, then I think you will have much better grip on the likelihood and chance that people are getting away with claims that are either untrue or stretching the boundaries of what they're actually doing. But the only caution I'd say is that it's not always intended with malified intent or a desire to hoodwink or cheat your customer or impress other audiences. Sometimes it's genuinely because even corporates are trying to figure out what they need to do. And I'll just end with one example of this whole carbon space, carbon measurement. It's well understood that the bulk of your emissions, as our keynote speaker also mentioned, will often turn out to be not in your direct control. It's somewhere embedded in your supply chain. And so you have what are called scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Most corporates will be able to quite easily measure scope 1 and scope 2, and they'll report that. And they'll perhaps make great progress on that and say they are doing so much for the climate. But if you've outsourced a lot of your operations to your supply chain, the bulk of your real emissions ultimately going towards the products that end up in the market are actually in the supply chain in scope 3. You're not reporting that, then, as far as the world is concerned, we're not a better place necessarily, especially if those scope 3 emissions are getting worse over time. But corporates will report scope 1 and 2 and end with it. So is that greenwashing, or is that reporting what I can measure? Because that's what I can measure today. I'm going to get to scope 3 over time, and then I'll start reporting that. So don't always take some of these things at face value, but is it a challenge and a problem? Absolutely. I think around the world, we are seeing many organizations that are now being pulled up for extravagant claims and sometimes false claims.
Thank you. I think we are learning. Umang, I wanted to ask you, so you're doing ESG advisory. So on that front, what have you seen in this space regarding measuring and difficulty measuring, and how can you help them?
So, as I was saying, it's an evolving space. What we have regulatorily, which is what most corporates first try to do, bare minimum, tick the box. You will see various spectrum of things. Organizations which are either part of global groups, their sustainability approach is different. But again, it's not for the reporting to public. It is reporting internally, which feeds into the strategy if they are that progressive. I think the first approach is to wait for regulator to say so. From top 100 to now we have come to top 1000, and probably some are still hoping that they'll get some extension. But yeah, I find, as I said, global footprints or foreign investors, because they are coming from the ecosystem of ensuring clean technology and access to clean technology in emerging markets. Storytelling is happening. When you pick up any sustainability report, honestly, it looks like a CSR report. We provided COVID kits to people, we provide water, we have opened a school, but it's not about truly the impact of the organization, how I do business, how it impacts the product services I make, it impacts people. So I think we are far from it, but yeah, the reporting has happened, so you can't keep reporting the same thing year after year. You have to transition. So yeah, in that hope.
Yes, so a follow-up question on that. So there's many different stakeholders in ESG, right? You can mention them again, because I know you love to talk about that. But also, I would like to know, how do you align those stakeholders? Because there's so many different ones. They have different goals. How can you align them around these topics?
So yes, as I was saying, shareholder capitalism came to stakeholder capitalism. Finally, we acknowledge that the business is not to only maximize wealth for its shareholders. So, and it's incorporated in our law. Our section 166 says the board has to act in the interest of shareholders, employees, protection of environment, and community. These are mentioned
Since when is that?
Since 2013, when the Companies Act was amended. But that's a different discussion, that how active is our social shareholder activism? Is there a class action? Do people actually held up? We get a crisis in an organization and you can see it's either an ES or G issue, but it does not do anything. Shareholders or even other stakeholders don't get anything. So just to summarize, these are your employees, your community, your people, your supply chain, the value chain is such a big thing. The key to this is cultivating and nurturing these stakeholders, the communication, so that it's not one-sided communication in a report as per law. It is a continuous symbiotic relationship. And that's what I believe. I mean, as I earlier also mentioned, when you are taking resources from this whole ecosystem and selling your product, so obviously there's a symbiotic relationship which has to be continuous, evolving, and which is where your complete business model and products and services should evolve from. What do I want to make for this, and who do I want to sell that? So,
Thank you. Thank you. So, Dr. Mukund, question on how do companies improve on ESG? What do they need to do in terms of strategy? Which people do you engage in the company? What level do you need to engage? Who is actually responsible? How do you make progress?
So I think the responsibility in the corporate world, I think squarely a lot of it has to be right at the top, the tone at the top, which means not just the CEO of the company, but in fact the board. And in fact, as Umang was mentioning the Companies Act amendment, actually the responsibility of the board is to create that balance in interests between different stakeholders. The simplest example of where you can have a conflict is, take for example a company that wants to do better with its employees. You can pay your employees a hell of a lot and ensure that all your profit margin goes into paying the employees, leaving nothing for the shareholders. So it's the board's responsibility then to decide, look, how does the profit then get distributed so that the shareholders also get their fair return on the investment they've made to support the company. So there are those kinds of trade-offs that will take place in the short term. The board's responsibility is in the medium to long term try and create a sensible balance that most stakeholders will be approving of and figure out is fair. Now, in terms of improvement, therefore, again, a lot of responsibility starts with the board. And I think the most critical issue that I think for a corporate, if it wants to really do the right thing in this whole space, starts with defining who you are and what you stand for. Because then a lot of things become much easier in your engagement with different categories of stakeholders. So going back to what they teach you in business school around what is your mission, corporate purpose, core purpose, what is your vision as an organization, and what are your values? How do you create alignment across the organization for these subjects? Then you start getting into where do you create the locus of responsibility then for an ESG agenda, for instance, which increasingly in Indian corporates these days, you will have somebody who's been given the responsibility of managing that agenda. It could be a chief sustainability officer, it could be the head of investor relations, it could be the CEO herself or himself. So creating that clear line of responsibility. And then a bunch of things that corporates will do, depending on the sectors they are in. For instance, the amount that you will invest on R&D, on innovation, the way you use your CSR to champion engagement with communities, try and motivate your own employees. So a bunch of initiatives, but it all goes back to, I think the root of it is, where is there guidance and a strategic direction? And to my mind, that has to come right from the top. And then it cascades across. And then, of course, you heard the speaker as well talking about how increasingly young people, for instance, are motivated by these issues. So your ability to attract talent, your ability to hold your employees in your organization will depend a lot on what they sense about your commitment on these issues. So there is pressure coming from the bottom as well. But I think the top is not convinced, is not playing a role, which is where hopefully we are also going to be discussing the importance of getting more women onto boards. Then a lot else will actually fail or will take much longer than it actually should.
Thank you. Yeah, that is one of my topics that I love to talk about, is about more women on boards and in C-suites. So thank you. Dr. Ashwin, I thought maybe you can tell us a little bit about the infrastructure industry and construction industry. That's your specialty. So I think in the construction industry, there's a lot of issues with ESG and using of sand and using of, materials that, who do they belong to really is the question, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are huge issues on the E side, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think there are also huge issues on the S side, particularly when it comes to gender equity and equality. Go to any construction site and try to see how many women there are in any capacity, right? All the way from project manager, all the way down to the unskilled labor. and you'll find very, very little, right? So it's an industry that I think is heavily skewed in terms of gender, at least on the execution side. On the design side, it's a little bit better. So you have fair number of women. And then if you go a little bit further upstream into architecture, you actually have more women. So I think we'll have to look at that value chain a little bit. But it is, highly gender skewed. And I just wanted to sort of, the other day I was at Larsen & Toubro, which is India's largest construction company, and they're actually building something on their campus. They're building another office building, which they told me was 100% being done by, project managed by women, which means the project manager, the project engineers, the site engineers, everyone apparently is women, except I'm sure the labor there are probably men. But I thought that was a wonderful example. And they were telling me that they are the second, this is not the first example in India. There's another example which I forget. So I think these are wonderful trends in an industry that is, it is the macho industry, right? The construction, the hard hat, the tattoos, the biceps. That's the perception of construction. So that's on the social side. On the environmental side, I think, and I tell this to my students all the time, this is the industry that is really responsible for global warming, greenhouse gas emissions. We spend 90% of our lives, all of us, in some kind of a built facility, right? It's a house, it's an office building, it's a mall, it's a theater, whatever it is, right? And these things are typically built with materials like cement, which are, where you have what we call a double whammy. In order to produce cement, right, the chemical reaction emits carbon dioxide. You cannot produce cement without emitting carbon dioxide because you take calcium carbonate. I don't want to get into the science of it. But then you have all of these other things, which is the processes, the cement plants and the transportation from the plant to the construction site consumes fossil fuels, consumes diesel, etc. So it's not an industry where electrification will solve the problem, because fundamentally to create cement you have to emit carbon dioxide. So on the one hand, there are huge environmental emissions in just getting something built. And then as you run these buildings, you've got lights and fans and heating and cooling, and lights and fans are not really the big issue, but heating and cooling buildings, and you've got to do one or the other. If you're in places like India, you need to cool. If you're up in Scandinavia, you need to heat. So either way, you've got to heat and cool, and the amount of energy that it requires is tremendous, and of course you can electrify some of it. So it's very important that this industry, among all other industries, really starts thinking about what it can do. There's a lot of greenwashing that's happening. Right? And I'll sort of call this out. There are green building certifications that are really not worth the paper that they're printed on in terms of actually moving the needle on environment. To be fair, it's a start, right? At least it's something that gets people to think about this, right? So I'm not dissing it altogether, but we need to do way more. I'll give you an example here at IIT where, we had there's this engineering design building, which was being built about 10, 12 years ago. And I said, okay, let's see if we can get this building certified. And I looked at the criteria, I looked at our design and said, no, this is not going to work, right? Because the design was already done. So I said, so we'll do it in the next building. But somebody hired a consultant, and the consultant said, no, you can get the certification. It's all about filling out the forms in this way, and I'll teach you how to do it, right? So I think we need to, the industry really needs to think about alternative materials that are less whose carbon footprints are much, not just carbon, methane, all of these other things, and ways in which we use these facilities in a much more responsible way, environmentally as well as socially. Right? So again, people, even in places like IIT, will leave lights and fans on because you don't pay for it. Right? So the disincentives of behaving unsustainably are very low. So, and a lot of that is going to take, going back to what Mukund was saying, obviously a lot of top management commitment. Right? But I think the problem with the infrastructure industry is that it's heavily fragmented. Right? To build anything, right? A building, a bridge, a road, or whatever, you've got hundreds of different companies that come together. You've got all kinds of consultants, designers, material suppliers, contractors, subcontractors, labor contractors, hundreds. And it's impossible to just flip a switch that will change all of them, which means the only feasible alternative is there has to be a bit of a policy push. Right? So you need sticks and carrots. You need penalties and incentives. You need carbon taxes and carbon credits or whatever. And without that policy push, and it's just one of those things that kickstarts, gets the thing started, and then momentum will take it on. So I think that's the big elephant in the room. If we can get good policy push towards ES And G, and when you get to G, you start talking about corruption and all kinds of other governance-related issues that, again, this sector is famous for. So you need a little bit of a policy push, I feel, to at least get started in terms of solving the problem.
Yeah. So, Umang, question, are you aware of any policy changes or governmental changes coming in the near future, regulatory, that would help in that direction, for example, in the building industry?
So, corporate sustainability is in different verticals again. One part is what you are today to transition towards sustainability, and a lot of other is designing new products, designing new services, designing buildings from sustainable fashion to tech as a solution to the problems, legal tech, agro tech. So the policy framework is evolving in all these spaces. So like circular economy, for example. So from your environment product liability changes that are coming into the law now, from your refurbishment to reuse, recycle, a lot of policy framework is happening around that. So which impacts various industries to transition, from consumer goods to even carbon intensive industries. You want to put one small project, you have all these policy frameworks, playing a role. But coming to core corporate sustainability, again, from behavioral, beyond reporting, we have to go beyond. And right now we are just debating here. Reporting, why reporting, with how reporting, which standard reporting. It has to move forward to business sustainability management plans. And yeah, no switches are flipping. You will transition. It will take time. Fossil fuel is not disappearing. It will stay. We are transitioning. We are trying. And that's how we need to work together. And instead of resisting this change in policy framework, like Indian budget has announced so many things from carbon sequestration projects, wetlands, mangroves, focusing on those things which are nowhere near corporate sustainability perspective. But all of this is working towards reaching those, SDGs or net zero or climate, whatever you want to look at, which also has impact on social, the adaptation, the mitigation, all that climate change consequences. So yes, a lot is happening.
So what you said about, obviously it needs to come from strategy, from the business management and so on. So now the question to Dr. Mukund, how do we finance this? Because, the management can say, well, we don't have the money to do it. So what do we do in this case?
So a couple of points. One is, we just talked about the fact that it's difficult to flip a switch. And sometimes people will wait for the policy and regulatory changes to drive it. But in some of these industries, I think the smart money is that the policy change is going to come sooner or later. And it's not necessary always it has to come in this country. It can come overseas. Case in point, for instance, European Union, which again, the keynote speaker talked about the fact that Europe is perhaps ahead of the game compared to other countries. They now have something on climate change. They have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to impose, in a sense, equalizing levies on imports from countries and industries like steel, aluminium, fertilizer, and so on, from markets where similar regulations are not in place. So in a sense, they're going to force the pace of change in other markets if those markets want to export into the European Union. So there will be industries, companies in India today, even in the absence of Indian regulation, that will want to do better in order to stay competitive with their exports, for instance. So I think regulation will play an important role, but there will be many corporations that want to be ahead of the curve because they see a competitive advantage to doing that. The second is, where does the money for all of this come? And there will be, I think, clearly at least two issues. One is the money will come if somebody feels that a corporate is ahead of the curve and is going to do better in the medium to long term, and therefore they're willing to finance this. So take, for instance, green hydrogen, which is now the talk of the town as a great new contribution potentially to solving the issue of reliance on fossil fuels, except that electrolyzer prices and so on are still too high. A lot of R&D has to happen to bring prices down. There will be people, risk capital, willing to take an advanced position, fund a lot of this. Some of India's largest corporate houses, the Ambanis, the Adanis, have committed to huge investments, 75,000 crores, things of that order of magnitude over the next 1 decade, because they see that being champions in these spaces will give them an advanced position over the rest of the market. So some of that will be self-induced because people think there's an incentive doing that. Some of it will come from risk capital. Governments in the US, now India has also announced a national green hydrogen mission, will also fund some of the R&D that's required to do this. So money will come from spaces where people think there's a competitive advantage for a country or a company. Then there will be, of course, where people see almost an immediate opportunity. So electric vehicles, for instance, in India. People see that not just because of the climate change problem, but issues around pollution, air pollution, the stuff that comes out of your fossil fuel usage, the particulate matter, is now becoming a problem for many car companies, two-wheeler companies, three-wheeler companies. Many of them are now looking to electric batteries, electric vehicles as an alternative. And it's being embraced quite swiftly, actually. Right now, a lot of it is also being fueled by subsidies from state governments, but those subsidies have been coming down. And there will be a point of time in the next 2 or 3 years when standalone, these products will be competitive with the internal combustion engine. So I think where you see an opportunity to make a hit with your customer base, to impress your stakeholders, to show the market your commitment to being ahead of the curve again, people are willing to make those investments. Then there is big money that is coming from different sources. There could be money that comes from the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, patient capital that has an eye on the long term, therefore wants to support causes that will matter in the long term. They're not too fussed about the short term issues, but they want to make sure that they're investing for a world which they are mandated by their principles to support and protect. Many pension funds now are increasingly decarbonizing the portfolios. I give you the illustration of Norges Bank when they pulled the investments in Tata Power, for instance, because they were decarbonizing the portfolio. And they were doing that because they believe we have to strive for a world where issues of climate change will no longer be impacting us adversely. So there will be different pools of capital, I think, that emerge that support the financing that is required. But it will also require some companies to be willing to take the risk a little bit ahead of the rest of the pack. And in cases where, we've seen already in things like electric vehicles, they will be, applauded for what they're doing. I'm told in this campus, one of the most famous startups is a company called Aether, which apparently many of the young undergraduates are aspiring to be like the startup promoter of that from IIT Madras. And it's because, they saw an idea, they decided to back it with their time, their talent, and hopefully they'll do really well going forward. So there will be some level of risk that people will need to take. So financing is not a slam dunk in many of these cases, but it's beginning to become easier. The last element in financing, I'll say, is the banking system. Increasingly now, central banks around the world are seeing that banks in their markets have to get with the program, have to understand the risk of stranded assets, of holding portfolio investments, where borrowers may not be willing to pay back if they're going out of business because of physical risks or transition risks. And therefore, banks are now being encouraged to be much more specific and particular about the kind of lending book they're building and reducing the level of climate risk. In India, the Reserve Bank of India came out with a very good paper on climate risk and managing that. They're encouraging banks now to reduce their loan exposures to companies that have significant climate risk embedded in their operations. They're urging banks to start taking insurance to avoid some of these loans going bad. So I think when the banking system, the lenders also start pushing the agenda, you'll start seeing money becoming more easily available for green causes. And then, of course, government will also have to play its role, as we discussed on the regulatory side and procurement, on shifting the agenda away from things that have been problematic in the past.
Just one quick follow-up question. So this is one side of the picture. The other one is ESG funds. Not all of them are actually really that ESG. Yeah. So can you talk about that?
That's part of the greenwashing issue as well. Yeah. In Europe, in fact, the European Union is now trying to categorize funds very strictly. And many funds are now having to remove the ESG nomenclature because it turns out if they made one claim, it is not actually borne out by the actual investments they've made. So that is a big part of the problem that is now sought to be fixed. In India, SEBI has just come out with a consultation paper, in fact, last week, where they want to, in a sense, guide the operations of any funds in the mutual fund industry that wants to present itself as an ESG fund. So they're trying to put in, and they've sought public opinion on this, clear tests of who can call themselves an ESG fund and who can't. And a lot of it hovers around the kind of strategy that you adopt. And they've defined 5 different strategies, from excluding certain sectors that you'll invest in, like oil and gas, to having an inclusive strategy of working with stakeholders, to having sustainability objectives like reducing carbon footprint, etc. So they've defined the categories, and they're expecting there will be much greater consultation with stakeholders. And they want the funds and the fund manager every year to give a report on how they've actually engaged with stakeholders. And eventually they want them to start talking about the impact they've created as a fund. So I think, as we discussed earlier in the conversation, we're getting better at understanding what we should aspire to, setting standards, measuring and reporting. And now the regulators start using that to start becoming more and more prescriptive about the do's and don'ts. And hopefully that will result in a cleanup and elimination of concerns like greenwashing.
Thank you, wonderful. Just quick time check. How are we doing on time? Okay. Okay. Shall we take some questions and then do the closing argument, closing later? Not arguments, I know, I'm just talking to a lawyer, right? Closing argument. Any questions?
So I'm Kavita, PhD scholar, Department of Management Studies here. So my research is on non-profit organizations. So my question is, how do non-profits actually fit in this ESG conversation? Because most of the time CSR's funds merely act as funding agencies. They don't actually implement, but they do provide funds to the non-profits, and they implement it. So do you have any suggestions for the non-profits, especially early non-profits, who could really focus on the spectrum? Thank you.
Very, very pertinent, and my one vertical is to focus on helping already purpose-driven organizations which already have proof of concept. They are not corporatized to be capital attractive. And these not-for-profit organizations keep looking at government grants, or then you have foreign funding, FCRA issues, then you have, and there's so much distrust issue that you need so many approvals. You have to get Niti Aayog approval, you have to get this approval and that approval. But simply, if you look at it, there are wonderful impacts that are being made. They're working at grassroots, so they have indigenous solutions. All they need is to become capital attractive the way we do for corporates, So that's exactly what we are trying to focus, to build a platform to the same way incubator accelerators work for startups, the same way, CSR is one channel of funding. Now there are global domestic impact funds, there are foundations, family foundations to family-owned business foundations. There is so much capital, crowdfunding is there. When you are totally focused on impact, the key which is missing and which we need to connect is same measurement of impact, telling your story correctly, and now with impending social stock exchange that is coming up, which will also probably connect the CSR allocations into these organizations, which will get listed like any other corporate. And they will be able to, sell their units the way shares transfer between, and they'll be able to publicly raise fund, and they'll follow the regulations, and they'll do the reporting exactly the same way stock exchanges work. So there's a lot of momentum there also, and as all the blended finance options have been discussed, the same channelization of money is happening. It's already happening with these not-for-profit organizations.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So whenever corporates take up strategy, revamping and all, they usually go for benchmarking system, right? So if at all a firm is not at all into ESG, is there any global benchmarking thing that they have to look into? And once they invest into it, is there any process measure? Not like how efficient they are, but is the process being done in the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. But This point about if a company is not on the journey at all, question we often get asked is, where should they start? And there is this concept of materiality, right? You understand what are the key drivers of success in your particular business, which are the most material issues that could emerge from that analysis of the key drivers of success. So let's say you're a steel company, carbon emissions will be a big part of steel manufacture. If you're an IT services company, then perhaps carbon emissions is not necessarily as big a factor in your ability to succeed. Maybe it's much more to do with the way you have talent attraction processes, your recruitment, the people you engage. So first you decide what is material to your operations and you pick a few issues. There are ESG assessment firms, for instance, they will track something like 700 indicators. And it's impossible for any company to have an ability to focus on 700 parallelly moving metrics. So pick, half a dozen, a dozen if you want, issues that you think are material to your operation and start with those. That also means that initially you're not fussed about, which framework am I looking at or which standards do I want to sort of aspire to. You're just looking inwards at your own business and trying to establish your baseline and then see, what can I improve? And do that internally with your teams. Then you start looking at the rest of the world and looking for peer comparisons, best practices, Indian, then international, and start setting your targets higher. There are a number of assessment frameworks you can use. There are many agencies that are also out there and willing to help. But start first with, figuring out internally what is it that you think you want to do. And that goes back to the earlier point we discussed about where does this all emanate from. It starts with the board and the leadership. A lot of it starts with first defining what are you trying to achieve as a firm. And therefore, what is your core purpose? What is your vision? What are your values? And then figure out, therefore, because I am this kind of corporate, this is my view about my stakeholders. This is the way I want to engage with them. And these are the kind of results I would like to show. Now let's look at where I'm currently in terms of performance, which are the key material issues, how do I start improving those, then let me look outside for more help.
Yeah, so I have a question for Dr. Ashwin, back to the measurement question, because there's also a timing issue, because often when the problem is very complex, we are tempted to just kind of fix a tiny corner and hope that kind of makes a difference. For example, in terms of measurement, carbon has become everybody's, North Star, if you will, but it's not a sufficient metric by any stretch of imagination. There are all kinds of other issues, environmental issues. So what is your realistic assessment of where we are relative to the scale and the timing? On a time scale, where do you think we actually stand? Because there are a lot of pressing issues and time may be shorter than we think it is. So therefore, what would be an appropriate response from your vantage point in terms of
honestly, I don't know. Right? I think you're right. We're running out of time, and so I think that's just why I was trying to say. I don't think we can boil the ocean. I don't think we can come up with this perfect measurement framework, but essentially come up with. So as long as we all agree that we need to be measured, and we come up with some standards that we say, okay, fine. As long as we're all using the same standard, that's what's really important. So that I can't twist the system by saying I measured it this way versus you measured it that way. And we use that as sort of benchmarks to constantly improve. I think that's as much as we can ask for, right? Parallelly, one can always continue to do research on better ways of measuring, better standards, better benchmarks, better tools, all of that. But to me, it's let's agree that we will measure, let's use the same benchmarks, and let's try to just improve on those incrementally.
Hello. Can I add? Hello. Thank you so much, sir, for the broad overview on the ESG and the other aspect of the environmental sustainability. Sir, in economic nutshell, if you talking about the corporate by the meaning is that means a profit-making organization. if you are focusing on the environmental ESG and all, let's say, sir, if you are that means we are a business corporate organization, we are focusing on the profit making aspect of the business, then as we are responsible towards the society, as we are using the societal resources. But the another part, some papers also evident that doing the ESG, that means before that means in Indian setup in 2013 the mandatory corporate social responsibility that came into exist. Before that, that means organizations has also. Okay, sir. The firms are doing the complexity, that means whether they do the social expenditure or environmental expenditure, because as your agenda of panel discussion is to why firms are not focusing on the social expenditure. If the that will not giving them the competitive advantage for a business profit organization, and then environmental expenses nowadays they are trending towards the environmental expenses of the ESG. Then how let's say I am not a polluting industry, why I do that means environmental expenses, then I will do social expenses. For this complexity, how the business firm will manage this kind of stuff?
Understood the question? Or should I repeat?
Yeah. So the question in a nutshell is about incentives, right? So why should firms do ESG? I think we all have our opinions on it, but I think at some point, sooner rather than later, it will probably make better business sense. And I think that's what Umang is also talking about in terms of this convergence between shareholders and stakeholders. And that can happen in multiple ways. That can happen through the incentives and penalties that I was talking about. It can happen through consumers deciding to buy these kinds of products instead of those because they're more aware that these are more environmentally beneficial. Therefore, companies shift towards that. So there are a number of pathways and mechanisms. And I think, as Mukund and Umang and others have been saying, there's a role that corporate leadership needs to play. And in my view, there's a role that policymakers need to play to put us on that path. But there is, to short answer to your question, I feel a set of incentives that can be aligned so that organizations can focus on simultaneously shareholder and stakeholder wealth. Okay, that's how I would answer that.
Maybe I'll just add a quick comment that we've discussed in the course of the last hour or so, risk and resilience, right? And corporates understand that. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think some of the PhD scholars we have sitting here will hopefully do that, around how to measure value. And a good example is, for instance, the impact on the natural environment. Year back, The Economist came out with a very interesting article. What is the value of a tree? How do you measure the value of natural resources? There is work that's happening today. For instance, there is a task force on nature-based financial disclosure, very similar to the TCFD, the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. It's trying to put a value to natural resources. As this kind of knowledge gets seeded better, I think corporates will see a way to link their actions with the profit motive. Regulators will see a way to challenge, penalize, tax, etc. So I think the science is getting better around a lot of this, and it'll start showing us more vividly than perhaps today we're able to establish the value of engaging with these different stakeholder groups and why you take actions in the short, medium, and long term.
Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah. Myself, Atul. My question is to Dr. Mukund. As we talk about the rating criteria and all, as you member of one of the committee established by SEBI, that is about the reporting. If as a researcher, when I look for the ESG ratings, there are so many different ratings available, like Bloomberg's and RIPSREC and others. So in Indian context, specifically when particularly one report of an outsider comes and make a devastation in capital market, how a committee and as a policymakers, you think that you have to bring a framework which will not be one fit for all criteria. So you need a different kind of reporting framework. So I would like to be listen from you as a policymaker who is engaged in this, like how you are dealing with these kind of issues.
So the big question we had was to make it simple for stakeholders, particularly since it's SEBI, the case of investors, and particularly the retail investor, who may not be financially very sophisticated. Is it possible to come out with one kind of score or rating that everyone understands what it means? So whether it is CRISIL, whether it is Equity, whether it is MSCI, whether it's Sustainalytics, everyone uses the same scoring model, and you then know what the scores represent. Today, for instance, CRISIL will come out with an ESG report which gives a score on 0 to 100. MSCI will come out with a scoring methodology which has alphabets from AA, AAA, B, etc. It's very difficult to compare and figure out what does AA in MSCI mean versus a score of 82 with CRISIL. The problem is the ratings firms have proprietary models. They're very reluctant to disclose what goes into those proprietary models. Their ability to sell those products to their target constituencies is contingent on them preserving that intellectual property, which they don't want to share. They also are tracking different numbers and different kinds of metrics. I mentioned that there is one agency which tracks 700. MSCI, I think, does 250 odd. So they're chasing a different set of things. And they believe that the proof of concept lies in ultimately the outcomes that the sophisticated investor is looking for, to whom they're selling these products. SEBI is, I think, seized of this problem, but they're unable to, at this point of time, persuade enough members of the credit rating or ESG rating constituency that they need to change their practices to come out with at least a common language that we all understand. The next best hope then is a body called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is trying to deal with the same problem amongst the various international firms. And there is a hope that some of the work that they are doing may yield something that creates a common language, and then hopefully a set of common scores down the line. But right now we are far away from that, because I think many of these agencies that do it really well don't want to share their intellectual property and are selling a lot of this product to sophisticated investors. So I think right now we'll have to wait on this. In the meantime, though, there are a number of new entrants in the market. There will be new ESG rating providers who think this is a problem worth solving. Let's try and explain in simple terms to the retail market what all of this means. And I think over the next 2-3 years, on the back of what Umang mentioned, the SEBI requirement that the top 1,000 listed companies have to produce the business responsibility and sustainability report, there will be a lot of focus on providing models and ways of interpreting the data that comes out for retail investors. And many of them will, I'm sure, do well. So maybe the next product that you can look at as a PhD scholar is creating something that makes sense to the common man and as a saleable product in the market. So it will come. I think it's just a matter of time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the questions. I think we're gonna close.
In the interest of time, I think it's good for us to close panel 1. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.